French Saint-Domingue was the richest colony in the Americas in the 18th century due to the production of products like coffee, tobacco and cotton. But because of the importation of slaves, very distinct and often hostile ethnic groups lived side by side. There were around 20,000 whites, divided between the wealthy planters and the less powerful Petits Blancs, teachers, merchants and the likes. And although the Petits Blancs were largely loyal to France, the planters favoured independence because it would allow them to export their crop to more countries rather than just to France. Otherwise, there were 30,000 free persons of colour, many of which were mixed race and lived in the south. Some of them went on to own slaves themselves and had more power than the Petits Blancs. However, they lacked some rights within the French system, so like the planters, they were largely pro-slavery and pro-independence. But the bulk of the population was made up of 500,000 slaves, which lived in notoriously bad conditions. And they often rose up. For instance, in 1759, some poisoned their masters as part of the Macandal Rebellion. Plus, many slaves, known as Maroons, managed to escape the plantations and lived in the mountains. Tensions between these groups escalated when the French Revolution broke out and the population had to choose between independence, monarchy, republicanism, slavery, etc. And in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Men also brought up the citizenship question. This is because slavery was not banned outright, and voting rights were later also granted to property owners, meaning Petits Blancs could not vote, but many free persons of colour could. So in early 1791, some Petits Blancs seized Port-au-Prince, forcing the French to send thousands of troops to the island to restore order. Meanwhile, Vincent Auge, a free person of colour, returned from France hoping to force the colonial government to grant the right to vote to all free black men. This was rejected, so with around 300 men he led an unsuccessful rebellion in late 1790 around Cap Francois. Meanwhile, as all this was going on, many slaves were able to escape and join the Maroons. And in August, outside Cap Francois, many Maroons met and held a secret voodoo service. There they selected their leaders to start a slave rebellion, including Georges Biassou and Jean-Francois Papillon, and just a week later the rebellion began. Within just a couple months the slave army grew to tens of thousands, and they destroyed hundreds of plantations and killed thousands of whites. And in the chaos, the free persons of colour, now led by André Rigaud, also led a small rebellion in the south demanding the right to vote. The French revolutionary government sent Sonthonax to the colony to try and restore order in 1792. He successfully made an alliance with Rigaud and began talks with the new rebel slave leader, Toussaint Louverture. But in early 1793 the situation changed drastically. The French beheaded King Louis and went to war against most of Europe. So the British Navy prevented supplies from reaching the island, and the Spanish began arming the slave rebels in the north. Plus, the colonists became split once again on issues like republicanism and independence. And Galbaud, the French general in charge of Cap Francois, had ambitions of bringing the surviving French royals to Saint-Domingue and began to conspire with the British. So to counter this new threat, Sonthonax promised freedom to thousands of slaves if they agreed to fight for him in mid-1793. They successfully defeated Galbaud, but thousands of whites fled, and in September the British landed in Jérémie. They were welcomed by many whites in Saint-Domingue because they promised to reinstate slavery and suppress rights of free persons of colour. So towns like Mont Saint-Nicolas, an important naval base, surrendered to the British peacefully, and they later took Port-au-Prince. The remaining French were therefore fighting the British, Spanish-backed slave rebels who controlled the north and west, and amongst each other. But this changed in February 1794 when the French government in Paris finally agreed to abolish slavery, plus in Europe the Spanish were losing to the French. So the French commissioners withdrew and gave colonial authority to André Rigaud, who consolidated power in the south. Then in May, Toussaint Louverture, for disputed reasons, decided to switch allegiances and fight for the French. Many of his old allies, including early leaders Biassou and Papillon, turned against him because of this. But with the help of his competent generals Henri Christophe and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, he was able to crush the opposing slave rebel leaders. Louverture therefore controlled the north while Rigaud had the south, and together they began to attack the British. The Spanish influence over the slave rebellion ended, and in mid-1795 the French defeated them in Europe, and were granted the eastern half of the island, but they didn't assert their authority over it. The French tried to send governors to the island to try and maintain loyalty and control, but by late 1795 it had become clear that slavery was over. However, a war for power between the free persons of colour and former slaves would soon break out.